And today we have a guest, Sundar Sarukkai. I welcome him to the session. Also, I welcome you all. My name is Leonardo. I'm a faculty at the School of Drama. I'll introduce this speaker. Sundar Sarukkai works primarily in the philosophy of nature and the social sciences. He has held positions of Professor of Philosophy at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, founder director of Manipal Centre for Philosophy and Humanities, and visiting professor at the Centre for Society and Policy in the Institute of Sciences. He is a founder of Barefoot Philosophers, an initiative to take philosophy to children and to the public. He is the author of the following books: Translating the World, Science and Language, Philosophy of Symmetry, Indian Philosophy, Philosophy of Science, What is Science, JRD Tata and the Ethics of Philanthropy, The Social Life of Democracy, and 2 books co-authored with Gopal Guru. He is a serious editor of Routledge Science and Technology Studies, as well as the co-chief editor of the Handbook of Logical Thought in India. So today we will be talking on the topic, the theatre of nature. I will give this.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this wonderful event. More than not just about theatre, but also the fact that we are amongst students. And I come in front of you not as a theatre practitioner, but as a teacher for many decades now, with students of different levels, PhD, postgraduate, graduate. But recently, over the last few years, a teacher who has been spending most of my time with children, trying to get them to think about philosophy through a series of initiatives on philosophy for children. So I'm really delighted to be able to come here to share a few thoughts on the larger questions of pedagogy, larger questions of what is it to teach and what is it to learn. And I'm of course interested in the context of theatre, and one of my great learnings in teaching theatre students has been my very long association with Ninasan, nearly now for 20 years, and for many years, I've been teaching the students philosophy. And in the name of teaching philosophy means to engage with theatre students, and Ninasan is one of the most vibrant theatre schools in the country, and you get students from very, very different backgrounds. So to teach philosophy to them, or to engage with them about philosophical ideas, was not to teach them a new discipline. I think students have enough disciplines to learn, but to actually get them to think about what they do as theatre practitioners. And to me, that is all the task of teaching is. And that is why when Abhilash so kindly asked me to come and talk on theatre and ecology, I agreed, because one of the greatest challenges facing us today are the questions of ecology. And in India, on the same level, one of the great challenges which India is facing today is art education in general, and theatre education in particular. When all of you know this far better than I do, the great challenges of bringing meaningful theatre practices. So I'm particularly delighted and inspired to be in a place like Kalamandalam, which has been a great source of inspiration for so many artists with whom I have worked, and I've heard from them, people who have come from Kalamandalam. So it's really a very wonderful occasion for me to share a few thoughts with you on this larger question of theatre and ecology, and the question of theatre and nature. And while that may seem like a very specific question about why should theatre be concerned about ecology, I want to use this point actually to raise a more basic question for students of theatre. What should you as students of theatre learn? I mean, that's a basic question I want to start with. So in a theatre program, you are taught very many different kinds of maybe history of theatre, maybe various kinds of theatre practices and so on. But what about the practice of learning to think through what you do? And in this, we have inherited in our kinds of educational systems, we have inherited a very artificial divide. And it's only theatre which has challenged it repeatedly in India. The artificial divide in education is between doing and thinking. As if thinking is a particular act which you will do sitting in classrooms and sitting in reading books and sitting on chairs. And whereas doing is something you will do with your hands, with your body. And theatre practice is obviously challenging this by asking how much of it should you do? In other words, what is your pedagogy about in terms of practical use of your body and skills versus the amount of time you spend thinking about what you're doing, thinking about the idea of theatre, thinking about asking, what is this process of theatre all about? And if you are doing that, then the question is, what should your training be in order for you to understand the theatrical practices that you do? So I want to keep that as the background question, not the question of specifically about ecology, but ask the question, what should you as a theatre practitioner think about, and what are the skills of thinking needed to critically reflect on your practice? For many practitioners who may think that because they are practitioners, they are the best, they are the ones who know that art best, that is a little bit of a problem, because as I'm sure all of you know, you may be a great actor or a great director performing a particular piece, but historians of theatre will try and understand what you have done in a very different manner. Maybe philosophers of theatre, people who use philosophical framework to understand theatre, understand what you are doing quite differently. And as I said, for me, one of the great learnings when teaching theatre students in Ninasam has been the two-way learning from both of us on my trying to see what they are doing in terms of a particular framework and them re-understanding what we mean by thinking about theatre. What kind of awareness does one need? Okay, so if that is the background, I want to specifically come back to this question, which I think an increasing number of scholars in theatre studies have been writing about, which is this relationship between theatre and ecology. And I'm so glad that this has been part of the theme for this particular session here. You might first start to ask the question, why this question? Because you could always have various kinds of things. I remember a few years back, a lot of discussion was on theatre and mathematics. And I don't know whether some of you were part of this initiative, where they thought that since a lot of children were presumably having difficulty in learning mathematics, they would use theatre to teach mathematics. And I knew some theatre professionals were very upset at the idea that theatre is not an end in itself, but was being used as a means for teaching physics and mathematics. And the argument here was, and in fact there was a big program in Karnataka where they tried to get theatre people to go around different schools in rural areas to try and get them interested in subjects like science and mathematics through theatre pedagogies in the classroom. So in other words, you learn mathematics not by sitting and writing something on the board, but in some sense through certain bodily practices, etc. That, by the way, has become a very interesting program in itself across the world. There's a very interesting programs on embodied teaching of mathematics through theatre practices. And that's, I think in my own view, it has its limitations, but if it is able to bring children to rethink what they are learning or to overcome the difficulty of mathematics, perhaps it has some validity. But I think as, for a lot of professional theatre makers, this was a kind of a problem. But on the other hand, can we ever consider theatre entirely as an end in itself, especially in a place like India? And that's a political question about theatre. In other words, if somebody asks a question, why should I talk about ecology? Why should I be worried about nature or climate change, which all come under this ecological crisis? One might then ask, what should theatre worry about? What is your purpose of theatre? What is your concern of theatre? And as theatre practitioners, you might say, my concern of theatre is the art of theatre itself. Whatever that you do, texts, performances, all these kinds of devising theatres and so on. But in the case, for example, in India, no social act, and theatre is a social act. You need institutions, you need a group of people to do it. No social act can be divorced from the social reality. And from my limited experience, for example, I know one of the most important impacts of theatre in India has been in this terminology, which is this kind of a theatre which is often been called as street theatre. And street theatre has had various kinds of expressions, dealing with very professionals doing it, to having school children and college children doing street theatre. And so street theatre has become a very important form of communicating theatre to the larger mass, having particular kinds of lessons and messages, and more importantly, and most importantly perhaps in the context of India, it was always related to political action. So it's almost as if when you use theatre to teach mathematics, and in the same sense you're saying, I want to teach theatre, use theatre to teach political consciousness, to raise political consciousness. Almost all activist groups that I know around the country have at some time or the other used theatre as a medium for increasing political consciousness. And there you might then ask, okay, are we really doing theatre? Can theatre get subordinated to activist ideologies? Should it be subordinated? Should you have the freedom to imagine theatre as an independent art form? Now, well, that may be a question that some of you may have, and I'd be happy to discuss it. In the case of ecology, why is there this increased interest in this relationship between theatre and ecology? One, of course, is the fact that today one of the most common terms which has captured everybody's attention is climate change. There are people talking about climate change everywhere, from the UN to the school. Almost every school syllabus in the country will have a lesson on climate change. There will be something about banning plastic and this and that. So climate change seems to be a problem. And it has become part of a media problem. In the sense, it's become part of a public, what we call as a public discourse, which has become part of newspapers. If you open a newspaper today, within 1 week's time, you look at how many times you will have a reference to the increased heat because of climate change. When there was flooding in Kerala, these terrible stories about flooding which happened in Kerala, you look at the number of reports in the newspaper, not by experts, who were all writing saying that it is climate change which is causing excessive flooding in Kerala. It is this ways in which we have engaged with nature which has caused the enormous amount of destruction in Kerala. So climate change has become now a term which we are now using to make sense of disasters in the world, problems with notions of what is happening around us in our life. And if it is a problem which is so much a part of our society today, can theatre be independent of it? And it is not that theatre is geared towards solving ecological crisis, which you can't do, but the larger question is, how should theatre respond to the question of ecological crisis, or to the larger question of ecology? You might ask why. I will come to that larger question here. So there is a very simple reason it has to respond to it, because it's a matter of everyday life. It's a matter of life which affects your practice. It affects your audience response to your performances. So it is part of the larger world in which you live. And therefore, it demands a response as professionals in any particular field of art to have your say about the idea of climate change. At least this is the larger argument which some scholars would do. But the more deeper interest in this is not to reduce the function of theatre and ecology to activism about climate change. It is not to write just street plays saying don't use plastic, reduce electricity, turn off lights and so on. That's just one part of it. I think the real interest, particularly from theatre studies people, is about whether theatre can help us reimagine, to re-theorize this problem of ecological crisis. In other words, where theatre is contributing not just as a kind of a performative skill, you're not coming there just to quote-unquote entertain us or whatever it is with your skills as a theatre practitioner, but whether you can change our minds about ecology, whether you can change our minds and our experiences with the idea of nature. That is the larger question which I think which is of interest to many of the theatre practitioners, scholars who are now writing on theatre and ecology. So the first question you would then ask is, well, if theatre has to do it, what is this thing about ecology? How do we understand the question of ecology? So ecology, as I'm sure so many of you are students or all done some logic somewhere like sociology, psychology, etc. Logos is about reason. It is so if I want to look at ecology, if you like, is a study of the environment, is a study of humans and humans' relationship with the environment. And it's a very simple definition, and if you want, it is a eco-logos, eco-logic, because some people would see it as a scientific study of nature and scientific study of human relationship with nature. That's, we can use it as a starting point, and different levels of professional discourse might change a little bit here and there. Now, one of the easiest and the first quick way in which ecology and theatre can engage in this sense is what was called, again, from historians of theatre, they point out it's about 30 years back in the early 90s, 92, 94, the call for ideas of green theatre, or what is also called as ecological theatre. And one of the questions about, you can anticipate what green theatre could mean. For example, like the greening movement, which is to reduce our carbon footprint, which is to reduce our impact on the world, based on our consumption. A very immediate, quick understanding of greening theatre would be to say, does your theatre practice, your performance, your practices, etc., your ecological world of theatre, how green is it? How green is it in the sense, how much impact does it have on the environment, for example? For example, if you're using enormous kind of sets which have various kinds of produces things which are very harmful to the environment, would it be that your theatrical practice has produced more damage to the environment? So in a very simple, just like our use of plastic, etc. What impact does your practice of theatre, practices of production, have on nature and the environment? That's an immediate, simple question you can ask, which is a very legitimate question to ask. We ask this question for industrialists, we ask this question of shopkeepers, we ask this question of people, of whether we travel in train and planes and so on. So we can ask this for a very, the reason why this has not become a major public question is because theatre practice is so less. It's so small, somewhere in a small place, and we don't really think that, what you're doing is really impacting any carbon footprint, etc. But it's already a sensitization to the point. The sensitization to the fact that theatre activity can also impact the environment, and I want to know how it impacts the environment. Can I minimize the negative impacts of the environment? That's one way of entry into this question of ecological theatre. Now, you could extend this, and that's what has happened when you extend this question of theatre and ecology away from looking at questions like your impact on the environment. Are you producing more, chemicals into the environment? And that's very little, actually, right? You can extend this by asking a more interesting question: how much does theatre actually deal with the themes of ecology? And this is also a very problematical question. It's a question of content, for example. So again, I come back to this question. Look at least if we look at theatre in Bangalore, which is a very flourishing theatre group, particularly for English theatre in India, you would see that there are quite a few which will always be dealing with some aspects of social realities. Some caste questions there, political questions, gender questions are very important in theatre. A very large amount of theatre productions which deal with some of these questions. In the same way, one way to ask about the relationship between theatre and ecology, or to sensitize theatre students to ecology, is to ask how much of your plays and performances actually deal with questions of ecological crisis. And if they do, how do they do it? So this is one type of question, which is what is your content? So you can think of an ecological theatre by saying it deals with questions of ecology and it deals with it in some specific particular ways. Part of this thing has been because of of the influence on ecological theatre from an earlier tradition within academics called eco-criticism, which comes in the context of literature, when people were using the questions of ecology, challenging the questions of relationship between literature and the larger environment. How do you read literature in order to situate it within an ecological criticism? And that has become now a very dominant program, and some of it has, of course, spilled off onto the question of ecological theatre. So, what then is the implication of putting ecology and theatre together? And this is a very difficult implication which I want you to think about, and I'm sure we can have many different opinions about it. One is that should theatre be concerned about its aesthetic form alone? Should there be a constraint on theatre to be able to respond to contemporary questions of ecology and climate change in far more robust and effective ways than it has been able to do? And at a very conceptual level, it is raising a larger questions whether it is possible to take the lesson from eco-criticism, whether it's possible to imagine an earth-centered approach to theatre. What would an earth-centered approach, which is a phrase which you view, as I said, comes from eco-criticism, looking at literature in terms of its relationship to the earth, the larger sense. What if I say, for example, let's say as an outsider, I'm conceptualizing something in theatre and ask you, can you think of an earth-centered approach to theatre? What would that mean? What would you do to your practice to make it earth-centered? I mean, keep aside the fact that you would say, I'm not interested in it, I don't want to do it. That's a different question. Just as an exercise of thinking about this, what would you do? So, therefore, the larger relationship between theatre and ecology is not just about the content, which could be about climate change, etc., but it's about the form of theatre itself. It's about the sensibilities which you present on stage for us. It is the places where you produce. It is also the purpose of theatre itself. I mean, all these you're questioning by bringing in the question of ecology into theatre. And it is an internal reflection, and I think, and as we go along, I'll explain why I think theatre is best suited to this compared to most other human activities that we do. So one of the ways by which they have tried to do this question of ecological theatre is to directly intervene in environmental issues. They've also suggested, practitioners have suggested a very interesting technique, and again, it may be of interest to those of you who want to think about it, that, in theatre, there are various kinds of metaphors of nature that is commonly used. So the question is, can theatre now produce new metaphors of nature? Can there be theatrical nature metaphors which can be produced in theatre? Some people have tried to say, well, if I really want to look at green theatre and theatre ecology, I will produce theatre not in proscenium theatres, I want to produce it in nature, do it outside in various places. And I'm sure you've seen many different kinds of productions which have happened in different places. I'm sure many of you know Routledge, and he was once telling us that how many of his performances and rehearsals were happening in forest areas, and there is a very different kind of a relationship with nature which was necessary for his actors to imbibe before they can act. The play doesn't have to be about nature at all. There is a kind of a relationship in the training of an actor. The relationship, in the training of an actor, one you can ask is a relationship to the culture you're studying, relationship to the text, etc. Right? So this was a very interesting point of view for me. Where is part of a training of, let's say, actor training, should it involve a training with a relationship with nature, a relationship of the human with nature? And that seems to be a very different. Why should I have a relationship with nature as a training of theatrical practice? But here was a very interesting case study, I think, of this kind of training, which, in my understanding of it, felt like it really changed the way they produced. They became an actor and they produced plays. And is it really so? So this is really about the fundamental question about our own engagement with nature and the ways of training, for example, actors and so on. There have also been other suggestions. Another specific suggestion is to say that theatre directors who are performing well-known plays can interpret those texts in terms of questions of ecology and environment and nature. And in other words, it's not asking theatre practitioners to choose very obscure texts or very specific texts on ecology or environment, but actually to interpret the well-known text. So there are some examples which I saw which people have apparently done. It includes Midsummer's Night Dream and also Waiting for Godot. They have been interpreted. So what you do is, there's a larger question which I'm sure all of you know as actors and directors. A text is not one which is directly reproduced on stage, and therefore you are doing something to the text and you are bringing your reflections on the text in your performance. Okay. Given that, you are interpreting that text in different ways. Some of you may interpret it based on your history, your memories, your culture. And the question, the demand of theatre and ecology is to ask the question, can you interpret it with more sensitivity to the question of nature? And the question of nature is hovering behind in every text. And it is for you, or maybe the director, or people, or the dramaturge, etc., who is involved in this production, who can give you an inkling of how to read the theatre, produce the theatre in a very different way once you do this. So, in other words, it is, I think, a larger, I think the interesting part of theatre and ecology is the fact that it questions the way. It questions your performance as a performer, not just about how you have understood the text, how you have understood the art of the production, but rather also, along with it, how you have understood the very idea of nature in your performance. And I'll explain to you why the question of nature and performance is so interesting and so fundamental to the very activity of what we mean by theatre. So this question of, it is not an added concept to say, think about nature also. Just like somebody says, think about your past, think about what you ate 20 years back while you're performing a role. It is not just about adding something else. The idea of nature is integral to us, is integral within us. And the idea of theatre is a fundamental engagement to the question of nature. And I want to end with that just to make that particular argument. So in other words, if I want to ask this larger question in the context of theatre pedagogy, which is to ask, how should we look at theatre and performance today to make theatre more ecologically sensitive? That's all we're asking, not whether you can change practices, whether you can change climate change and so on. And so, including the experiments like community theatre, changes of design, immersive theatre, participatory theatre, have all claimed that they are trying to do something like this. And that's why you're experimenting constantly with the form of theatre. But in spite of all this, there is a fundamental resistance to these kinds of questions within theatre. And I'll just use the last few bits of my occasion just to tell you why that kind of a fundamental confusion continues to occur, and therefore how do we respond to it? And it goes back to the very definition of theatre. One of the things which I said, which has influenced modern society so deeply, is this very artificial distinction between doing and thinking, so-called a very modernist paradigm, although it has its roots in very ancient philosophy. The fundamental problem about theatre's engagement with nature comes because of another kind of a binary, another kind of an opposition. And that opposition, which I'm sure has influenced all of you right from school, is the opposition between nature and culture. So we produce a lot of our disciplines come in with that kind of a hidden assumption that there is something called nature and there is something called culture. And this distinction has had great influence on how biology as a discipline has developed, how various kinds of disciplines, even within the social sciences, have responded to this. But what is the difference between nature and culture? If you really ask what is the fundamental difference, it goes back to the problem of the human within nature. Who is the human being within nature? It's a very simple question. Do we belong? So let's just go back to our most basic definition of nature, right? What do you call natural? Suppose you ask, what are natural things around you? You would point to the tree, the birds, the shrub, and things that are growing around. You would show the rocks and the mountains and the rivers and say they're all natural things. How many times have you shown people and said they're also natural? Look at the way our construction of nature has been influenced by this. For example, when you look at a nest of a bird, you would say, oh, that's a natural, whatever it is, a nest. It's a natural built thing. You look at something as complicated as a beaver's dam, which is a very complicated construction, which apparently is the only construction which can be seen from outer space as a whole big construction, the beaver dams, which goes miles across. You call that natural. Whereas I look at a simple building like this, you call this building man-made, artificial, a cultural artifact. Why is not a honeybee, a nest, an anthill, or a beaver's dam seen as products of culture? Historically, the distinction between nature and culture this artificial distinction between nature and culture is the distinction of only one thing: humans and non-humans. It is a particular cultural incapacity to understand humans as part of a natural order that produces this kind of a binary, which has a very deep implication, particularly on the very idea of art. So, for example, you would have a let's say, a very beautiful building, like a honeycomb, for example. A honeycomb is not going to be a structure which you're going to put in a museum, because a honeycomb is a natural product. There's nothing creative about it. And the very idea of being creative in art is often located around the action of the human individual, a particular expression of the human individual, which breaks the order of nature. So constantly, historically, all attempts at defining the human have been in the ways by which we differ from quote-unquote order of nature. That there is some way in the fact that what makes us humans, and particularly artists, is the fact that you can break the expectations, the functionings, the limitations that we have as in terms of humans. And you might ask the question, isn't this obvious? Why should we think of it as a problem, this binary between nature and culture? First of all, it is not obvious. Many traditions do not see nature-culture binaries. You do not see it in many pre-modern traditions, not just in India, they are endemic. In fact, even your performance traditions are far more endemic in different ways compared to the way in which the relationship between the human and nature is present. And it is a particular kind of a construction which becomes more and more entrenched in the largest sphere of modernity. So we need to ask this larger question: how should theatre imagine this distinction between nature and culture? Is theatre an activity of the mind, or is theatre an activity of nature? Whatever that means. I'm posing it as a question for you to think about. And this is very ironic in the context of theatre. I mean, scientists can do this. Scientists do these artificial distinctions because it helps them solve their problems. So that's a fundamental way of doing science, fundamental aspect of scientific methodology. I choose what to study, I simplify it, keep it out. But in the context of theatre, there's a great paradox. And the paradox is this: the first great example of theatre is nature. In fact, the example of a spectacle, the example of an awe in presence of a presentation, when nature presents herself, itself, whichever gender way you want to see it, your response, or the way in which we respond to the presentation of nature, is the first response of an audience to a spectacle, or even a very simple aspect of presentation on stage. Nature not only acts as a fundamental medium by which we begin to understand the meaning of theatre. If you remember early visual art, painting for example, for a very long time, painting was actually about mimicking nature. And if you look at various philosophical debates, they all revolve around a very simple point till a particular time in medieval times, that all that art, all that humans can do is imperfectly imitate nature. Nature has already done the best paintings in the world, and all that I can do is paint it a little bit so that it can look like it. So the question of mimesis becomes a very important part of our very understanding of art. And mimesis, of course, as many of you as theatre students know, plays a very important part in theatre. Now, this idea that art can only be at some level an imitation of nature was not just an influence in theatre, in art, visual art alone. It was also a very important matter of debate among people who try to understand music and philosophers in the context of music. Whether all that the best music that humans can do, can only be a fraction of the kind of music that nature has anyway produced. The greatest painting that you can do can only be part of a reflection of the magnificent views of nature that we get. And therefore, in the context of art, its relationship with nature is fundamentally different from that of the concept in which how science looks at nature. And therefore, if you ask this question about, the question about how nature is so fundamentally involved in this, both as a spectacle, as a model, as something which inspires what theatre should be, you see that there's a very strong relationship to it. But in rewriting art as something which belongs to culture, as something which belongs to the sphere of the mind, you have removed this, you have fallen into the binary of nature and culture, and theatre then gets placed within the domain of culture much more than the domain of nature in which it should have been present. There are implications to this. One, and you might say there is no way to get out of it, and there's a good reason why you can't get out of it, and that is the question of language. And this is actually a very deeply interesting philosophical question, which, again, the question of language is something which is so essential to theatre, particularly when you work with various texts and so on. But a reflection on what is language, which philosophers do, like philosophy of language, raises very deep questions about what is this relationship between language and theatre. How do we, and of course, it's the theatre practitioners who have really taught us how to even think of theatre without language. That you don't necessarily need language for it, or that there are different quote-unquote different types of theatrical languages which are not verbal languages and so on. But still, there is this very fundamental tussle between the role, how important is the question of language within theatre, whatever we mean by language. And why that again pushes theatre into the domain of culture is because language is seen as a product of the human mind. In fact, one of the things which often strikes me so starkly, and it's something which really influenced me to write a novel, my latest book, which is called Following a Prayer, is about the fact that nature, if you look at nature, and because the story of a little girl who gets lost in a forest in the Western Ghats, and for 3 days she's lost in the rain, and if you have seen Western Ghats in Karnataka, you know how it is. And she comes to a very simple realization. She realizes that it's only humans who have language. She hears sounds of millions of creatures around her. And she thinks that none of them have a language which speaks. So just in her 12-year-old mind, and that's really what started me to think and write about it, there comes a very simple thought. It says, humans have produced a language and all language is a lie. Because we lie only through language. If you did not have language, ask yourself whether you can lie. And what does it actually mean? So, that's a very different kind of a question, exploration I do. But the point here is this, that there is a fundamental philosophical problem about understanding language, and whether language is part of culture, or whether it's part of nature, or whether language is very special to human beings, and language is very special to theatre. So you see how the links, these conceptual links actually influence the kind of things you do on stage. You may not have thought about this or pushed at these points, but they're very much a part of it. And I think the biggest problem, and that's why the question of ecology and theatre is, I think, becoming far more interesting for us in various ways, is a very simple observation that it is very difficult to define nature. I've been using the word nature, right? And if you really ask the question, can you define nature? What is nature? It's one of the most difficult problems today, and there are both in science and philosophy and so on. So rather than getting into it, I'll just conclude by making a few simple points about our own engagement with this question of nature. Having pointed out that these are the kinds of difficulties you may encounter, the most simplest question I want to begin with to end my talk is to ask the question, do you study nature or do you experience it? Now, if you look at the case of a science, as you know, for science, all of the disciplines of science, for them, nature is the object of study. They want to describe nature, understand nature, tell you knowledge about facts about nature. But for the idea of there are two, just like these different binaries that we talked about, there are two very important binaries which are also very important in the distinction of art and science, for example. And that is the distinction based upon the idea of experience. The fact that when I'm watching a play, I'm not just gathering knowledge about the play. I'm not just gathering information about what story the play is saying, what is it saying about the historical time, about the characters, etc. That may all be there. But there's a larger context, what some people call as the aesthetic experience of watching a play, a larger context of experience, which is so central to it. And if you extend this question, just like you ask this question of an audience who is watching your play, your performance, and asking, how did you experience this in some common way? What did you feel about it? What was your feeling about it? If you extend this to a very simple question about nature, ask yourself the question, not about what is nature, how do I define it? Leave that to people who want to do that. Ask yourself, how do I experience nature? And part of this question of modernity is the fact that we have forgotten how to experience nature. Look at how many children, at least in cities, I can tell you, and increasingly in very urban areas, how many children tell me that I have not seen the sky in a very long time? How many of us in cities actually have seen the sky? To see the sky is to have an experience of whatever the world has to offer around us. To be able to stare at a tree and just sit in front of it and experience it is a very different way of your engagement with nature than talking about it or drawing it or whatever else that you do with it. And nature as experience is actually very closely related to the idea of theatre itself. In one sense, when you sit and experience nature, the aim of that experience is not to learn what the color of the tree is and how it feels to you. Nature of all kinds of experience is ultimately learning about yourself, not about the object of experience. Because the experience happens within you. It is being mediated through you. It is dissolving into you. Any object that I see, when I'm experiencing this room, it is there, I'm seeing this object, but to experience it, it is to allow this object, this vision of it, to dissolve into me. And that experience of nature is a pedagogical strategy. What I'm placing before you is to say that if you really want to take the question of theatre and ecology seriously, then this practice of this learning to understand not just the different meanings and aspects of nature, but also getting trained in learning to experience nature in its most widest form is something which actually comes very close to the expectations and the practice of theatre itself. And there are many such examples, of course, as you have seen. I can give some examples of the Kochi Biennale president, also in ITFOC a couple of years back of this wonderful Lebanese group production. But there are, I'm sure you yourself know this various ways. But there is one caveat, and I'll end with that, which is that if a very meaningful interaction between theatre and ecology, any meaningful way in which you can take this further has to happen, it has to happen by reflecting on these things. That's why I began my talk by saying it's actually about pedagogy. What do I teach for theatre students? Why should I teach theatre students not philosophy as a discipline, but why should we teach them about conceptual thinking? Why should we teach them about why they should have clarity in thought? What kind of thinking, etc. So hopefully I've given you some map of why that is. And I'm ending with this point about nature's experience. But the only caveat I want to say is that experience has also today in modern world has become a vicarious experience, which is we experience it from outside. We experience it as some people would call it. Experience itself becomes a commodity. I can experience anything. I can experience, like in Bangalore now, I keep talking about this, but it's such a good example. There are all these restaurants which sell poor man's food. So village food is sold in restaurants in Bangalore so people can taste what poor people eat, and they're very expensive to go to these restaurants. These are really commodifying and creating vicarious experiences of other people. And theatre, an actor by definition is in the domain of experiences. It's in the domain of taking on other experiences. And that's I'm sure you all discussed this in great detail. But I'm saying that immersion in the producing the experience of nature, which produces ecological theatre, is not a vicarious experience. It is an experience which has to lead to greater sensitivity. It is an experience which does not lead to greater knowledge. It is an experience which leads to greater awareness of recognizing that the humans are not outside nature. And if theatre, even if it is a product of human beings, it is still completely immersed within new forms of understanding of nature. And that's why when some people, scholars of theatre ecology, say that the task of theatre is to produce new metaphors of nature, that is, new ways of understanding nature, not in a binary between humans and nature, but in terms of other kinds of differences. What they're basically saying is, how do you reuse this experience of immersion and interpret your very simple things like acting, directing, reading text, interpreting text, and so on. And perhaps when we do that, we may recognize that nature is as much a living organism as us, and we are just one part of this extremely diverse, complicated expression called nature. Thank you.